event. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our training on evaluating POS and PSI RFP responses. We're just going to give everyone a couple more minutes to trickle in. But in the meantime, I'm going to put the link to a survey in the chat box. It's a really brief survey, and we would love for you all to um, access that survey at the end of the training and let us know what you thought and what we can do to be supportive in the future. So I'm sending that right now. We'll have plenty more opportunities to share that. And in the meantime, we will just give everyone a couple minutes to join. Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us for our training session today. I have a link in the chat box for a survey that we'll ask you to fill out after the training just to get your thoughts and feedback. And we'll just give it 1 or 2 more minutes to let folks give everyone a chance to join who wants to, and then we'll get started in just a couple minutes. So thank you again for joining us. Great. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We seem to have a good number of attendees, so I think it's 1:05, and we should go ahead and get started. So thank you so much for joining us today for our training on how to evaluate RFP responses for POS and PSA contracts. We're really happy to have you here and really happy to share with you this next sort of chapter in our training series, and we hope that you find this useful. We're really lucky that our colleagues from the Harvard Kennedy School Government Performance Lab are going to be running the show on this training. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lars Benson, one of our Harvard GPL fellows, to kick us off. So Lars, over to you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that lovely introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our training on RFP evaluation processes today. As Julia said, my name is Lars Benson. I am a Government Performance Lab fellow who works closely with OPM Finance. I think many of the folks in the audience today have worked with the Government Performance Lab on RFP processes or on trainings in the past. So we're really excited to see all of you again today and share some of our thoughts on successful RFP evaluation periods. This is a topic where over the course of our work with agencies in the last 2 years, we have heard a lot of questions on how to organize an evaluation committee, who should be scoring proposals for an RFP, and how best to facilitate scoring discussions. We're going to be answering a lot of those questions here today, as well as providing some best practices and guidance on how to conduct a successful RFP evaluation period. I just want to confirm, it looks like a few people in the chat are indicating that they can't hear. Hopefully the audio issues are resolved, but definitely let us know if that technical difficulty continues to persist, and we'll try to work that out. I'm just going to go ahead and proceed for now. I should also note that this training will be recorded, so if there are issues and you miss parts of the presentation, you'll be able to see the recording after the presentation is over, and we'll send that out via email with some other tools and resources to follow up. I want to say thank you to Julia Fussfeld, who introduced herself at the beginning, OPM's Procurement Policy Development Coordinator. Julia has been leading a fantastic series of OPM procurement trainings over the last year that I'm sure many of the folks in the audience have attended. I'm also very lucky to be joined today by 2 procurement leaders from human service agencies, Kathy Lenahan, who is the Director of Grants and Contracts for the Office of Early Childhood, and Sheila Hummel, who is the Business Development Program Manager at the Department of Economic and Community Development. So you'll be hearing more from Kathy and Sheila later in the presentation and when we do the Q&A. Next slide, please, Julia. Great. So I want to start by just giving you a roadmap of where we're hoping to take today's training. We're first going to, at a very basic and high level, talk about what the evaluation process for RFPs is and orient ourselves with some terms so that we understand a lot of the material we'll be presenting later in the hour. Julia is going to share with us some of OPM's standards and policies on POS and PSA evaluation, which are great to keep in mind as you structure your evaluation process. We'll talk about some of the common challenges in evaluation processes and give you all an opportunity to share with us some of the challenges that you've come across. And then we'll share our approach to building a successful evaluation process in a few stages, using a great example of an OEC RFP that we worked closely with Kathy on earlier in this year. We'll also close out the session today by sharing some tools and templates for evaluation, including a new RFP evaluation workbook that OPM is going to be releasing later this month. Next slide, please, Julia. So what is proposal evaluation? I'm sure that this proposal timeline at the top of the page here is going to look familiar to folks who have navigated RFP processes in the past. Obviously, an RFP process is kicked off with designing and drafting the RFP document itself. An RFP is publicly released and then proposals are received after a certain period of time on the street. We're talking today about what happens after those proposals come back in, your evaluation process. When a group of your agency's staff, referred to as an evaluation committee, are reading each of those proposals and scoring them based on pre-established scoring criteria to ensure that there is an objective and a rigorous evaluation of each of those proposals before you can move on to the final step in an RFP process where you are making award decisions and issuing awards to the selected contractors. So evaluation is really important as a part of this process for a few reasons. For one, a robust proposal evaluation process helps your team select the best suited vendor or provider to provide the scope of services that you are looking to find. That is pretty self-explanatory. An evaluation process is also an opportunity to leverage your team's expertise, their experience, and their knowledge in the program area to ensure that their interests and their needs are represented in the selection of proposals. An evaluation process can also help surface issues with proposals or vendors that may need to be addressed later during the negotiation or contract management phases. A common area where this persists is pricing, right? You may get a proposal that comes in over budget and realize that you need to work with a vendor to get that within the scope of the budget that your agency is able to offer. Evaluation processes also, and I think in many ways this is their most important function, create legitimacy and objectivity for procurement decisions so that your agency can be sure that you are evaluating proposals in a way that is objective, fair, and potentially stands up to legal scrutiny if there is a challenge as the result of an evaluation process. Next slide, please, Julia. There are, of course, a few risks that are incurred when you're undertaking an evaluation process, and these are good to be aware of as we're talking through some of our materials today, where we'll share how you can mitigate some of these risks. For one, it's difficult often to evaluate an organization and the program that they might offer to your agency simply on the basis of a single proposal. And flashy or well-written proposals with complex language and cool graphics can sometimes make organizations look more qualified than they are. While some smaller, newer, or more community-based organizations might fly under the radar with proposals that aren't as showy, but ultimately be able to provide a higher quality of service in the program that you're looking to procure for. Proposals that are otherwise strong contenders or would be well suited for your scope could be ruled out for deviating from minimal technical requirements, things like formatting, for example. And you don't always want to eliminate a really high quality proposal just because they chose to submit it in Arial font instead of Times New Roman. Proposals may not include key information that's necessary to make award decisions. So if you're not getting the information that you need to evaluate proposals according to your scoring criteria, it's hard to determine who the best proposer actually is. And this speaks to the importance of writing good proposal questions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And of course, your evaluators might be affected by biases or conflicts of interest. They could have a personal relationship or a financial relationship even with some of the potential contractors that are submitting proposals. And it's important as an agency to keep out ahead of that and ensure that your evaluators understand that they need to maintain the highest possible standards of impartiality and non-bias throughout this process. Ultimately, the risk in any of these evaluation processes and what all of these risks build towards is that you may select a vendor that ultimately fails to meet the RFP's requirements. And as a result, the program or the service that you're procuring for may be unsuccessful at meeting your goals. And we're going to talk today about how you can avoid that final risk coming about. But before we get into that, I want to hand the mic back to Julia to share a little bit about the guiding standards and policies that you should be aware of from OPM about the evaluation process. Julia?
Thanks, Lars. So I think there are a couple basic things I want to cover that are specific to OPM standards and policies. As you might be aware, OPM is statutorily required to issue procurement standards to provide guidance for agencies on all manner of procurement processes and policies. And we have such a document on OPM's website. And it does cover a little bit about the proposal evaluation process. So first and foremost, the standards are really meant to provide guidance, and agencies are meant to use that guidance to inform the creation of their own more agency-specific policies and procedures. So with that in mind, agencies do have broad discretion over their own evaluation procedures. That includes who you're assigning to the evaluation process, what your evaluation criteria might look like, and sort of anything in between. We provide some thoughts on how to answer those questions, but ultimately those decisions are in the hands of the agency. The next thing I want to cover is that the one important area where OPM imposes some rules and regulations in the standards is around confidentiality and conflict of interest. So we do really want to make sure, as Lars mentioned, in some of the risks in the inherent in the evaluation process, that we're minimizing any potential conflicts of interest and that we're keeping the entire process confidential so that nobody can gain an unfair advantage in the RFP process. And so the standards do provide a sample form that you can give to anyone involved in the RFP evaluation process that allows them to either disclose any conflicts of interest, recuse themselves, or attest to the fact that they don't have any conflict of interest, such as, a stake in one of the bidders or any other such sort of conflict that would make them unable to be unbiased in their review and evaluation of proposals. And we also have a form, and that form also includes stipulations around confidentiality. So again, as I said, making sure that everyone who's involved in the process is keeping the communication really tight-lipped and following OPM's communication procedures. The next thing I want to point out from the OPM standards is that an important thing to remember is that at the end of the evaluation process, the evaluation committee will sort of rank the proposals, and those top 3 proposals will be submitted to the commissioner or the head of the agency as a recommendation, and ultimately the commissioner will choose from will make an informed decision based on those top 3 scores. And as I mentioned, the standards do leave a great deal of room for agencies to impose their own processes and procedures. And another place where we provide a little bit of guidance is on the debrief and appeals process. And this is sort of the process after a evaluation period is complete, and then a decision has been issued. A bidder might contact the agency and request more information about the process, learn about how they selected the winner, and even potentially in some cases appeal the process if they think there was some wrongdoing or conflict of interest. So the standards provide some pretty broad guidelines on timelines and responsiveness to those types of requests. But again, we leave a lot of discretion in the hands of the agencies to figure out what's most realistic for you given staffing constraints. But ultimately, it is something that is a best practice and that we want to guide agencies to figure out how to do. So for any additional information, definitely encourage you to look at the OPM procurement standards and see what we say about developing an evaluation process. But Lars will go over some of the more best practice guidance throughout the rest of this presentation. And if you have any questions, there's contact information in the OPM procurement standards and lots of great written material in there. So I'm going to hand it back over to Lars.
Thanks for sharing that, Julie. I really appreciate it. Before we get into some of our strategies for running the evaluation process, we wanted to collect a little bit of feedback from all of you. So I know many of the people on this call will have navigated evaluation processes themselves in the past. Some may be new to this, but I know we have a lot of great experience in the audience. So I wanted to pause for 5 or so minutes and just ask the chat. We'd love to hear, if you have run an evaluation process, what the biggest challenges you faced were. And we have some challenges that we ourselves have realized, and we're interested to see how these map on. So I'm going to be quiet for a minute or two and let folks post in our Q&A any challenges that they have navigated in the RFP process, or areas where they're particularly confused about how to run an effective evaluation.
Definitely don't be shy. Go ahead and put in any thoughts that you have in the chat, and we can all kind of learn from them together.
And I see somebody had noted that they sometimes wonder whether their evaluation committee can consist of employees from other agencies. That's a great question and an area of confusion that we hear from a lot of folks. Definitely one challenge of navigating the evaluation process is figuring out who's appropriate to seat on an evaluation committee. I think we'll circle back to that question and talk about it in more depth during our Q&A. I can say the short answer now is evaluation committees often comprise individuals from other agencies or even from outside your agency, from community groups or universities who are subject matter experts in the type of program that you're trying to evaluate for. So I think a really robust and diverse evaluation committee can be really strong and important for an agency.
We have another comment here from someone who says one of the challenges they face is having too many providers in one area applying and not enough in the other areas. And then how do you sort of look at the larger picture when thinking about multiple potential evaluation projects and how bidding to each of those might relate to one another, which is definitely a great point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we hear from a lot of human service agencies that are putting out RFPs for really large and complex programs. And the larger and more complex the scope of your RFP gets, the more difficult it is to evaluate. So that definitely speaks to the importance of preparing your evaluators well. I see a.
Go ahead, Lars.
Sorry, Julia. I see one more comment here that I'll read out here from an agency that is planning to run a large RFP process and anticipating that they'll get many more qualified proposals than they have funding for, and wondering what the best way to establish a process for grievances that might come from the lack of funding is. That's a great question. Obviously, we're working with really limited resources often for these RFPs, and it's difficult to pick the best of the number of really successful, strong proposals. We definitely recommend the creation of a debrief process to help those unsuccessful proposers understand why their proposals did not get selected for funding, and connect them to other opportunities for that funding, or keep them, in conversation with the agency about future RFP opportunities. So that's a great concern. I see a couple more that just came in that I'll read out before we move on around subjectivity and conflicts of interest, and those are absolutely challenges that are difficult to navigate. And I think we'll share a few ideas on how to tackle those. For now, though, Julia, I think we can move to the next slide.
Great, and I'll keep publishing those challenges that I think probably other people face so that we can have them on the record and address them later as we go along.
That's great, thank you. So a few of the challenges that we heard map onto this list that we've come across through our work on various RFPs with agencies. And I've sort of sorted this list into three categories that I think people might recognize. The first challenge in a broad sense is that analyzing these proposals can be a really subjective thing, and we're trying to work towards objectivity in the process, but we're also aware that it can be hard to read for the content of proposals instead of the style, right? If you're reading a proposal that is full of typos and misspellings, it's difficult to set that aside and not have that color your perception of the organization, versus reading a proposal that has charts and graphics and data visualizations that really look showy and flashy, which might obscure a little bit less substance in proposals. So that is certainly a challenge. It's also hard to balance your need to be objective in the process with the frequent need to have flexibility, right? And often work back and forth with the providers and vendors that are submitting proposals to find the best fit for your program. So striking that balance is a challenge. And then there's also a challenge with asking clear and specific questions in your RFP that actually collect the right information. Because if you're looking at a huge variety of marketing materials from providers or vendors that don't necessarily answer the questions that you have in your head as you're thinking about the success of your program, it's really difficult to objectively analyze those and evaluate them relative to each other without clear questions that are in place across all the proposals that you're reading. A second big category here is that your scoring criteria can often be vague or unclear. Big categories like organizational qualifications don't always allow you to hone in on the specifics of what you're reading for in each of the proposals. Describing a perfect score clearly to your evaluators can be challenging, because you don't always know when you're setting forward in the RFP process exactly what it is you want to see from proposers, and you may actually want to learn more and remain open to many different types of proposers with many different types of approaches to the program that you're procuring for. Calibrating evaluators to ensure that their scores are consistent is also a challenge. Some evaluators might give an average proposal that they think is pretty good, a 7 out of 10. Other evaluators could give that same proposal a 4 out of 10, right? So knowing your evaluators and understanding how they approach each proposal is really important, but also very difficult to do. You also really want to align your evaluation process with larger strategic agency goals, and that can be hard. We got a question or a comment earlier around the difficulty of reading many different proposals that don't always fit into the areas or the regions that you're trying to fit them into, and needing to see that forest for the trees and understand how that full picture fits together, especially when you're dealing with large and complex scopes. And then the final category here is that evaluation committees themselves, as groups of people, can sometimes be difficult to manage, as any group of people is. The workload of reviewing proposals can be really unpredictable and difficult for individuals who have lots of other day-to-day responsibilities in their jobs to do. Engaging people from across your agency, from program areas, fiscal areas, budget areas, operational areas, it can be hard to bring all those people together, and their different expertise may sometimes clash during your discussion. So moderation and facilitation of those conversations is really important. It's also really important during those conversations to ensure that the discussion is fair, it's egalitarian, and it's friendly, and that it doesn't take 6 hours per proposal, right? As it can really be easy for these discussions to start to drag on. You also have to navigate those interpersonal dynamics, right? Of what if somebody is sitting on an evaluation committee that their direct supervisor is also on, and they have a different opinion on a proposal. It can be difficult to create that kind of collaborative space where everybody is comfortable coming forward and voicing their perspective without fearing that they're going to be judged by other people on the evaluation committee, or feeling that their voice or their opinion is not as important as other people's. You really want to create that egalitarian, democratic environment. So you can go to the next slide, please, Julia. Thank you. We're now going to talk a little bit about the stages of an RFP evaluation and what you can think about to better prepare your agency for success at each stage. As we talk through each of these stages, I'm going to be joined by Kathy Lenahan from the Office of Early Childhood, who is going to share some of her experience working through these stages on the Office of Early Childhood's Home Visiting RFP, which is a really large, challenging, and ambitious RFP that we supported earlier in the year, which was really successful in its approach to evaluation. So just briefly, the stages of an evaluation process that we're thinking about today are: 1, establishing scoring criteria when you're creating your RFP that best represent your agency's goals. 2, writing effective questions and requirements for your vendors or providers to respond to that directly connect to those scoring criteria and actually solicit the information that you want to see in your responses. 3, forming an evaluation committee that has expertise in the subject matter and reflects a diverse array of perspectives and experiences across your agency. And 4, finally, scoring and discussing those proposals and making your final award decisions. And this is a process where each stage really builds on the next. Any weak link in this process can create a lot of headaches and a lot of extra work down the road if you don't fully engage with each of them. So let's take establishing scoring criteria first, and you can go to the next slide, please, Julia. So a successful RFP evaluation begins with the scoring criteria in your RFP. It begins actually before the evaluation phase even starts. Your scoring criteria are the factors that your committee is going to consider when they're assigning scores to a proposal. Those scoring criteria and the weights that you assign to them should represent your agency's priorities for the procurement. So for one example, many RFPs that we work with include a scoring criteria for something along the lines of organizational qualifications or organizational experience that will assess things like how long your proposers have been delivering similar programs, the qualifications of their staff and their staffing model, and references from other jurisdictions they might have worked with on similar programs. So depending on the RFP, you might want to weight a scoring criteria category like that at 20% of your total points, or perhaps you would determine that it was a high enough priority to have an experienced organization provide the services that you might weight it at 30% or 40%. You might also make use of sub-criteria within that big category to prioritize certain pieces of information within those larger categories. So taking our organizational qualifications example, you could break that out into the organization's experience and the experience of individual staff members based on the resumes that they might submit. So you must establish these criteria before the RFP is released, that is in standards and statute, and stick to them consistently throughout the evaluation process. So you can't change your evaluation criteria after the point of the RFP being released, and that makes it really important to fully discuss each of those criteria with the folks in your agency who are going to be reviewing the proposals, with the folks in your agency who are going to be managing the contract, and anyone else who has a stake in the selection of a successful contractor. You want to make sure that the providers who are responding to the RFP understand what information they should provide and highlight in their responses. And so for that reason, we recommend that you actually list the scoring criteria in the RFP itself. And you may choose to rank those in order of priority. So if you had one for the description of the program, that might be your first priority, or you had one for the cost and budget, that might be a little lower down the list. And you can even provide the weights that you're planning for each of those scoring criteria in the RFP document itself, so that when a potential vendor or provider is reading your RFP, they look at that list of scoring criteria and they can say to themselves, okay, we see that diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations are weighted at about 20%. So let's make sure that 20% of our response is used responding to these questions on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that ensures that you're getting the level of detail on each criterion that you want, and that vendors understand and have that transparency to know what is most important to your agency. You don't want to just get generic marketing materials from every respondent that submits a response to your RFP. If you want to see more examples of scoring criteria, you can find some in the OPM RFP template. There's an RFP template for both POS and for PSA procurements, and that's available on OPM's website. We'll send that link out after the training along with some of the other materials that we're talking about today. So I'm now going to pass the mic to Kathy Lenahan from OEC, who is going to talk through the other half of this slide and share with us a little bit of information on how the OEC established scoring criteria in the recent home visiting RFP. So over to you, Kathy.
Thanks, Lars. So again, my name is Kathy Lenahan. Lars did an introduction in the beginning. I'm the Director of Grants and Contracts Unit at OEC. And as Lars was saying, this home visiting RFP was a rather large RFP for OEC. And it really was looking at a home visiting programs that had been offered for over 20 years in the state, but really thinking through a redesign of the home visiting system. And so before we even sat down and put pen to paper on scoring criteria and actually the writing of the questions, OEC had a very thoughtful engagement and set up a learning process that took, well over a year, that included listening sessions and focus groups to understand families' needs. We looked at needs assessments and data from across the state. And all of that helped inform the writing, the criteria that we selected as we were putting this together. And so when we talk about how did we choose the criteria, we leveraged all of that early work that was done. So that there was a full OEC stakeholder group that participated in earlier sessions. We leveraged what we developed for the problem statement, like what were we trying to solve, what were the outcome goals that we had for this RFP. And then we use those to identify the criteria that was most critical to finding the right providers for the service array. Our sprint group, so we had different levels of folks participating. We then had a sprint group. We participated in the RFP sprint through OPM, drafted the initial categories, and then the writing team fine-tuned the criteria prior to the RFP release. I will say that we also, so we identified the larger criteria, and then within each of those, we broke them into sub-criteria. So the RFP writing team leaned on, to some extent, some home visiting subject matter experts. We further defined specific elements of the higher level criteria and you're going to see an example of that in one of the later slides. And part of these decisions were informed by lessons learned from previous RFP scoring process. And we wanted to make sure we were able to capture some of the more specific and nuanced ideas and topics in the different categories. And so we worked not only just with big, large criteria, but then into the sub criteria for each of them. One of the other things that we worked on is, how did we establish weighting them? And so the RFP team, obviously we started with an initial allocation of how much each of these criteria would be weighted within the scoring process, and then it was vetted with OEC senior leadership before the final approval. And then I think, one of the other, the last bullet here is, we deliberated between the balance between transparency and how prescriptive we wanted the RFP to come across. And in the end, we erred on the side of transparency. And so, the thought that went into that was, as Lars had talked about earlier, there are some really great grant writers out there who might be able to put together a well-written proposal. But we also have providers who are much smaller agencies, and we didn't want them to spend a lot of time trying to sort through our RFP and see what is OEC looking for. So we were fully transparent in the RFP, and we identified all the criteria. We identified the sub criteria. We put a chart in there that said how each of them would be weighted. And we went, as far to say as things like, what would a top score look like? So we put it out there because one, it was important for us that everybody was operating from the same baseline. And we, obviously the most important thing is that we get good proposals that meet the needs of what we are looking for. So.
Thank you so much for that, Kathy. Really appreciate your perspective and the detail. It sounds like you were really successful in developing well-balanced scoring criteria. The next section that we want to talk about here is the development of questions and requirements. And this is a natural next step once you've established your scoring criteria. So during this stage, you want to think about how to collect the information you need from proposers in order to score on the criteria that you've settled on. And you do this by writing clear and specific proposal questions. Investing this time up front to write good questions can save you a lot of difficulty during the evaluation phase. And just like your scoring criteria, questions will need to be finalized before the RFP is released. I know that's a little self-explanatory since they will obviously be included in the actual RFP document. You might find it easy to organize the questions beneath your criteria in a way. So you might have one criteria, as I mentioned before, for diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations in the contract. And then the questions for that scoring criteria could include the respondents' internal DEI policies or questions on how they might gather perspectives and feedback from clients throughout the lifespan of the program, the demographics and the makeup of their workforce, how they'll provide culturally humble and culturally competent care to the target population they're working with, or any other question that you might want to ask about pertaining to that specific scoring criteria. And if you organize your questions in this way, you'll be able to be sure, first of all, that there aren't any questions that are asking for information that you aren't directly evaluating on, and that you're collecting all of the information you need to score on each of the criteria that you've deemed to be important. If you want to take those questions to an even more specific level, you might consider using case studies or examples. So you could ask potential providers how they would provide services to a client with specific needs, an expectant mother, for example, or somebody whose first language is not English, or have them describe a program of similar scope that they've run in the past. And think as you were writing these questions about the language that you're using and try to use plain language with consistent formatting. You want it to be really obvious what you're asking applicants to respond to so that you're getting high quality responses. You don't want to write questions that are only understandable to people with a PhD, right? Or people who are native English speakers. Turning to the OEC example, Kathy, could you talk us a little bit through your process for writing these RFP questions?
Yes, we'd be happy to. So here on the right, you can see an example. So this would have been a sub criteria for one of our main criteria. And so the sub-criteria is we were looking for a skilled and culturally diverse workforce, right? And so we've come right out and identified that's going to be 8 points within that criterion. And what we did was we mapped out where in our RFP questions that should be answered. So here's an example of where we say to score A4, you look at the response to 4.47. And in this case, Lars, as you were saying, you can use case studies. We did use a case study that we put into the RFP and we asked folks to respond to. So, and we did this throughout the RFP. We had an accompanying document for all of our evaluators, which was called the Detailed Scoring Guidance, which basically was a roadmap for the evaluators. It identified all the criteria, it identified all the sub-criteria, it had and where they would find what questions would be referenced to meet that criteria. And we also went so far as to saying, what you're looking for, right? And so it was all mapped out from the RFP through this detailed scoring guidance that we think made it easier for our evaluators to understand what the criteria were, understand the sub-criteria, and then know where in the proposal they were looking for those answers. On this page is, one of the lessons learned, which is don't write the questions and criteria as separate exercises, right? You need to make sure that they're linked together. And initially with this RFP, the questions were written separate from the criteria, and then as we were trying to map out, as Lars was saying, make sure that our questions are getting to what we're looking for. We realized that it really is a joint exercise to be making sure that you've got your criteria identified and then your questions are reflective of that, and so that your answers can be matched and will be getting you to a really strong application.
Thank you for that, Kathy. I think we can go to the next slide, please, Julia. So let's talk a little bit about building your evaluation committee. So once those scoring criteria are finalized and your questions are written, you're going to want to begin assembling this evaluation committee. Depending on the process for your specific agency, you might undertake this either before or after the RFP is released. But a best practice is to try to establish your evaluation team earlier rather than later, so that those team members have a chance to provide input on proposal questions. You're recruiting them to the evaluation committee, after all, because they are a talented, diverse group of people with a lot of different important perspectives from across your organization. So it makes sense to try to also gather those perspectives on the questions they'll be scoring on. When selecting those evaluators, you might consider a variety of different factors. So think about what expertise and perspectives they might bring. It's helpful to try to combine fiscal expertise, program expertise, legal expertise, even, to ensure that your team is able to review every aspect of a proposal, with the understanding that each proposal is going to come with complex budget documents, for example, that you'll need to have somebody on the team who is able to read and understand. If the RFP is for a client-facing service, for example, and the proposer is going to be working directly with vulnerable populations, you might consider having someone on your team who works closely with that population. Evaluation can be really time-consuming, so you will want to ensure that your team members can commit the necessary amount of time. And of course, that exact amount of time is probably going to be unpredictable, right? Because proposals themselves, depending on their length and complexity, can take as long as an hour or even more to thoroughly read through and score. And you won't know exactly how many proposals you're going to receive until your RFP closes and you're already in your evaluation period. So you might consider bringing in a subject matter expert from outside your agency, and that could be a representative from another agency, I think, as somebody had suggested earlier when we asked for questions, or somebody from a university or from a community group who is an expert in the type of service that you're looking to provide. And leveraging expertise from all these different areas inside your agency and potentially even outside of your agency is what allows your team to work together as a unit to holistically evaluate each of these proposals. A really important thing is that you'll also want to appoint a facilitator, and that person will be responsible for managing the evaluation process. This facilitator needs to be someone who can commit a substantial amount of time to the evaluation process and works closely with the leadership of the agency to ensure that they're representing the agency's priorities. They'll generally be responsible for reading each of the proposals themselves, even though they're not actually scoring them, just to get an understanding of what's in them and what some of the considerations and questions that they should be asking of evaluators are. They'll want to be preparing and distributing scoring sheets for the evaluators to use during their individual scoring periods. They'll be running an evaluation meeting for committee members to discuss those scores and probably contributing to an evaluator orientation earlier in the process as well. And during that evaluation meeting, that facilitator is going to be responsible for asking questions and introducing topics from the proposals that they've reviewed to get evaluators to explain the scores that they've given and identify any areas of disagreement or confusion. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to run those meetings successfully on the next slide, so I'll leave off on that for now. But suffice to say, this is a really important and very challenging part of the evaluation process. You might find that there are certain topics in some RFPs where very few people in your agency are going to actually have the knowledge that's required to objectively evaluate them. This definitely happens in every agency, and it's certainly nothing for your agency to be ashamed of. And that's a great opportunity for you to engage experts from outside the agency as non-scoring participants. You can bring in technical advisors to help fill some of the gaps in the evaluation committee's knowledge. Obviously, you still want those technical advisors to be adhering to the highest possible standards of confidentiality and impartiality and having them sign the same non-disclosure type agreements that you're asking of your evaluators. But you may bring them in to answer certain questions from the evaluation committee about complex parts of the process, and they can offer some of their own expertise without providing their own scores. Kathy, I know that OEC had used a really unique and effective approach during the home visiting RFP of engaging multiple evaluation committees. Could you talk a little bit about that strategy and some of your takeaways that you might be able to share?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So as you know, this was a rather large RFP for us, and we all know the time commitment it is to review one applicant, and we want to make sure that we had enough time for each application to be thoroughly read and scored. And so we were trying to manage the number of applications that we would get, not knowing how many would come in. And so the structure of this RFP was we were receiving applications for 6 regions. And what we decided to do is to have the applications scored within regions. They weren't scored over the course of across the state, but within the regions, because that's how they were going to be awarded. And so to try and come up with a manageable number of applications that our evaluators would review, we decided to come up with some scoring teams, and each team would be assigned to score 2 regions. And so we had, and it gives you kind of the high level here, is that we had 3 scoring teams. Each of them had 4 evaluators on them, and they had an alternate who went through the full orientation along with the ones who were the evaluators. And we also had the non-scoring facilitators. So we had 3 non-scoring facilitators. We also created an evaluation team, which was, I was the chair of that evaluation team along with the division director from that program. So that was our family support division director and our COO. And so, you know, we engaged many folks to actually make this a reasonable, be able to turn it around in a reasonable amount of time and give the time that's needed to review these applications. And so the lessons, you know, some of the lessons learned, you know, when you need that many evaluators, and we are a smaller agency, it really took, you know, commitment from the top, from leadership. So the ask and the introduction to this RFP happened on the leadership level, where we reached out to all the division directors and folks in management saying that we were going to be seating evaluation committees, and we were asking for their support and their thoughts on who of their staff might work for these teams. And so once we got the managers' buy-in, most of the managers recommended a couple of their staff, and then we really formalized the process by sending out an invitation to participate on the evaluation to these folks who were identified, which really outlined the time commitment. We put out the schedule of the number of days it would take. It really was, it was an invitation to participate. And then folks had the opportunity to say yes or no based on their individual schedules. But I think it worked well. What we tried to do is we tried to have, just as you were saying, program staff that are knowledgeable about those programs or had some experience in home visiting. So about half of the folks who were on each of the teams had experience in evidence-based home visiting. We also looked for at least 25%, so one person on each team who was really comfortable and strong looking at data, because that was an element in this RFP. And the other person, the other 25% of the scoring teams were cross-divisional staff, but folks who have been recommended by their division director or their program manager, and who might have scored an RFP before, or who might have some connection and knowledge of the communities that we were looking at, or some base knowledge of home visiting. And you say here to be mindful of interpersonal dynamics. When we had the pool of evaluation, potential evaluation participants, we did look across and make sure we tried to, match up teams, one that would bring diversity to each of the groups, and would kind of hit on those, enough folks on the team who had the knowledge of home visiting, who were strong in data, and brought a different perspective. And that was all part of the consideration of who ended up on what team.
Fantastic. Yeah, really love the focus on getting a diverse array of perspectives that you clearly brought to that recruitment process. So turning to the final stage in the evaluation process on the next slide. Once this evaluation committee is in place and you've selected that facilitator to run the process, you're able to actually move on to scoring those proposals that have come in. So the first thing your evaluators will do is score those proposals individually using the materials that you can prepare for them. So in order to best prepare them for that individual scoring period, you should consider holding an evaluator orientation where you bring these evaluators together and you can give them a summary of the RFP and the scope, remind them of the details of the program or service that you're procuring for. You can walk through the scoring criteria that have been selected and explain your interpretation of each one of them, as well as the proposal questions that are connected to those scoring criteria. And you can talk about what you'd like to see in terms of responses to those questions, like Kathy was describing earlier. You might consider what a model answer looks like in each of those questions and discuss what that model is with your evaluators so they have something to compare the proposal answers they're reading to. You'll also, of course, want to go over the very basic rules of conduct for scoring, like maintaining confidentiality and making the agency aware of conflicts of interest. And you can review some of those standards and policies that Julia shared about evaluation within the OPM procurement standards. That orientation meeting is also a really good opportunity to do a little bit of practice scoring exercises. So you can walk through an example answer to one of your questions with those evaluators. And you might want to point out positive and negative elements in your hypothetical example and see how they respond and how they can identify certain elements that you're looking for in the answer. You could have your evaluators offer scores for that example to help understand how each of them score. As I mentioned earlier, just like you have tough and generous teachers in schools, you're likely to have tough and generous evaluators in an RFP proposal process, and it's good to know upfront whether an evaluator's baseline for an average middle-of-the-road proposal is a 7 out of 10 or a 4 out of 10. As your evaluators start scoring, you're going to want to offer them a point of contact who is able to answer any questions about the RFP or the scoring criteria. This might be the facilitator of their evaluation committee, but in examples like the one that Kathy was sharing, where there's a number of different evaluation committees, and then there's a RFP team that kind of sits above that, Your point of contact might be someone like Kathy, who has that overarching knowledge and understanding of the RFP and the program. Ideally, this is going to be somebody who is working to manage that contract or working to manage the program. Once the individual scoring period is completed, you'll bring your committee together to have a discussion about the proposals. In a few minutes, I'm going to share a proposal evaluation workbook that we've created and that OPM is going to be putting out as an optional tool that can help structure those meetings. But as general practice, these are difficult meetings to facilitate. That doesn't mean that they're impossible, and that doesn't mean that you can't have super successful, really collaborative and supportive evaluation committee meetings, as we've had with many different agencies. There are a few things to keep in mind to make sure that you're bringing out that collaboration. So it's helpful to structure this meeting around working through each proposal one at a time. The facilitator can offer a quick summary of key details that they've identified from their reads of the proposals, things like the proposed budget, the program details, or the target population, and those can kind of help to jog the evaluator's memory so that they can recall exactly what they were thinking when they were reading the certain proposal that you're discussing. And then ask those evaluators to share what they most liked or disliked about the proposal, the pros and cons or the strengths and the weaknesses of each one. And as they share these reflections, you're most likely going to notice areas of disagreement between the members of your committee, and you can ask those committee members to further explain their logic and talk you through how they interpreted each proposal. And finally, once you've discussed one proposal in depth, it's a good opportunity to give your evaluators a chance to revise their scores in case they've learned new information during the discussion. And this is bound to happen, right? If you have an evaluator who is an expert in the program area but doesn't necessarily have the fiscal and budget and data literacy as another evaluator, and that second evaluator makes a really good point about how some of the numbers in the proposed budget don't quite add up, that first evaluator may not have realized that during their first read. Like I said, these are really long and complicated proposals, and organizations that submit them will often, use really impressive language to paper over elements of their proposal or their record that aren't as strong. And the point of this evaluation committee is that your evaluators are working as a team. So it's not an adversarial process. And I think in that spirit, you do really want your evaluators to be open to changing their minds and having a conversation and thinking about revising those scores. So you give them a chance to revise those scores, and then once you've repeated this process for each of the proposals that you're considering, your final set of scores is going to help you identify the highest scoring proposals, and you can move on to finalize the awards and make the funding allocations correspondingly. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy one more time to talk through OEC's approach to scoring and discussing proposals.
Yeah, thanks, Lars. Just as you see on the left-hand side, the evaluator orientation, I mean, that was the start for us. And I'll just let you know that at OEC, it was a mandatory attendance at this evaluator orientation. It was about 90 minutes. All evaluators had to participate in it, and we did, do most of what he was talking about, which is one, trying to level set for everybody who might not know as much about home visiting. So there was an overview of the RFP and the home visiting and the goals and the problem statement. It was the opportunity for them to see some of the tools that had been created for them for the scoring, to do some practice scoring and really try to build the confidence for everyone who was going to be participating in the evaluation process for this RFP. So as you can see, what we did was, it was very structured in that we did the orientation and then we established a reading period of 7 days, and that was cleared with program managers so that the staff would have enough time to do this reading, and so they each read and scored these applications individually. They prepared their score sheets and they sent them to the facilitator in advance of the scoring discussions. The scoring discussions were also scheduled in advance, so people were well aware of when these would take place. For this RFP, it was 3 days of scoring discussions. I will say that what made this a little bit more challenging was that this was in the middle of the pandemic, early on, and so this was 100%. Everybody was in 100% telework, so these scoring discussions were virtual, which added a whole nother type of learning for OEC and a dynamic to that. But I think, you know, they established some rules in the very beginning. Cameras were on so people could actually see each other as they were having these scoring discussions. And, you know, they participated, they shared their scores, they participated in a discussion, as Laura said, they were able to listen to other people's perspectives, and if they chose to, they changed their scores or revised their scores. And those would become the final scores that we used for the selection. Some of the lessons learned, Laura's talked a little bit about, is make sure the proposals are on hand, you know, so people can go back and reference it. You know, if they had notes, they can go back and look at their notes, and offer guidance on scoring for cost and other quantitative factors. This was particularly challenging in home visiting because the applications could select one of several or multiple evidence-based models. And so when you're trying to determine like reasonable cost in a budget, we put together some background information for the evaluators to make that judgment. So for example, one home visiting model might cost, you know, $200,000 for you know, 2 home visitors, where another might be a more intensive model, and a reasonable cost for that model might be $500,000 for 2 home visitors. And so we put together some of that information for our evaluators so they could determine reasonable costs, because it was quite challenging. And for that piece, we, you know, went to the national experts on that, and we went to the evidence-based models and tried to, you know, give some parameters around that. But that was probably more unique to this RFP than many others. So that's what we worked on.
Thank you for that, Kathy. And I also really appreciate your acknowledgement that working in the pandemic does present a new and unique set of challenges in facilitating this process. It's one thing to have everybody sitting around a big table and reading the proposals together. It's very different to have them looking at Zoom. So that is a really great call out and really impressive that OEC, I think, was able to adapt successfully to that new model. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about what comes next. This is not, you know, the focus of our training today, but I did want to just briefly walk through what the next steps after you settle on your final scores generally look like. This process will probably differ slightly agency to agency, but some of the general principles are, for one, once you've determined your top scores, the evaluation committee itself is not actually responsible for making those final award decisions. That's the responsibility of the agency's head or commissioner or a designee. So according to statute, your evaluation committee is required to report the top 3 proposers for each potential award to the commissioner. You might also want to include the full list of proposers and scores for additional context, as your commissioner probably won't have sat in on every evaluation committee. The commissioner is then responsible for making a decision about which of those names to select. In RFPs where you're going to make multiple awards, like you're awarding by region, as the example Kathy gave for home visiting was, or by different pieces of the scope, you're submitting a list of finalists for each of those awards. So that can be a slightly longer list. In that report to the commissioner, you might also want to provide various details that summarize the committee's discussion of the top scoring proposals to help better inform their decision making. Once the commissioner makes a final decision, it's also a good practice to document very clearly the rationale for that choice. This is especially important if the commissioner, for example, chooses not to grant an award to the committee's top ranked proposal, right? And this way, if there's a challenge to the RFP process or if there's a future audit of the agency's procurement practices, you're going to have that clear documentation that lends additional legitimacy to the process and makes it very clear exactly how each of these decisions was made in a fair and objective way. After those award decisions are issued and you've sent out notifications to successful and unsuccessful proposers, there are a few post-mortem activities that you can consider doing to close out that evaluation process. So we always think it's wise to collect feedback from your evaluators when possible to assess what you might be able to improve in the next evaluation process. So you could ask whether scoring criteria were specific enough or whether the instructional materials and workbooks were easy to understand for evaluators. OPM also definitely recommends that agencies offer debriefing meetings to unsuccessful proposers. We mentioned this a little bit earlier. In that debrief, you can walk through the organization's proposal, call out some of the strengths and weaknesses that the committee noticed as they were reading it, and give that proposer a chance to ask questions about why that proposal wasn't selected. This is, in the first hand, a compassionate and a kind thing to do, right? Since those organizations spend a lot of time and resources putting together these proposals for you. And of course, you are going to want them to feel comfortable submitting responses to future RFPs and not discouraged by this process. And secondly, it's also a really good opportunity to be transparent with your providers and vendors so that they don't need to go through a formal challenge process in order to understand why they were successful. Those challenges are obviously a big headache for agencies, and they can really slow down the process of getting contracts in place. So anything that you can do during this debrief to ensure that your relationship with these unsuccessful proposals is really friendly and positive is going to save you a lot of difficulty down the line. Next slide, please, Julia. So we have a few tools that OPM has put together that help to support this proposal evaluation process. I'll quickly go through these now, but we'll also be sending out an email that includes more details. OPM has developed a variety of tools, the POS and PSA RFP templates, which I'm sure a lot of folks in the call are already familiar with. We had a training on how to implement those that was delivered earlier this year that you can find in the OPM website. Those both include sections on evaluation that help to set you up for success and provide a template for you to fill out with your scoring criteria. The new proposal evaluation workbook, which I'm going to dive deeply into in just a moment, offers a standardized tool that helps you structure the individual scoring periods and the discussions that you're going to have with your evaluators. And of course, the OPM finance team is always available to provide ad hoc support and light touch technical assistance on RFPs and evaluation processes. So let's hone in on number 2 on this list, the new proposal evaluation workbook. Next slide, please, Julia. Awesome. So the OPM Proposal Evaluation Workbook is a new tool that's been developed to make evaluation processes more efficient and less time-consuming. Some of the benefits of this workbook are additional support for agencies who are less familiar with this process and want a template to be able to work off of, a standardized experience for evaluators, and we're working to standardize this not just across human service agencies, but also with DAS procurement. There is flexibility for agencies to customize their evaluation workbook as they see fit and as they need. And it includes some tips and ideas and strategies for facilitating effective evaluation meetings. I should note, as I show this to you, that this workbook is a completely optional tool. It's something for you to use if you find it useful. And of course, we definitely welcome any feedback that you have if you start to use it and you realize that there are areas where it could be improved or areas where it could better reflect your needs. We'd really love to hear that from you. So just for a few minutes, I'll try to keep this to no more than 8 or so minutes so that we have plenty of time for Q&A at the end here. I am going to wrest control of the screen sharing from Julia. Apologies, Julia. And I am going to walk you through what this human service RFP evaluation template looks like now. So just checking. Yep, looks like everyone can see that. So there's a few tabs at the bottom here, and I'll explain each tab in order, starting with this guidance and checklist tab. So this guidance tab is a great cover sheet for your evaluation process where you're able to log the dates where the RFP process was initiated and when it was completed. You're able to document who your evaluation team was and log their position so that you can see where you're getting various types of expertise, where they're coming from and what level of your agency they're working at, as well as document all of their contact emails. So you have that in a handy spot. There is a guide on the left here on how to use this workbook, and I'm going to talk through much of this content right now, so I won't go through this in detail, but it explains step by step exactly how to go through the evaluation process and incorporates many of the best practices and tips that we'd shared earlier in the training. And then finally, there's also, as you can see here, a proposal evaluation checklist. So you can remove these tasks and fill in whatever tasks your agency's specific RFP process might incorporate. And you can use this checklist to track when each of them are completed and make sure that you are not forgetting any steps of the process and that you understand exactly what you have to do next. Turning to the overall scores tab. I want to familiarize you with a few things on this tab. So our vision for this worksheet is that you would take 3 of these tabs, the overall scores, the technical proposal, and the value proposal, and you package those into a worksheet that you send to each of your individual evaluators, and they use that to document their individual scores. The whole document is maintained by the facilitator. So here, let's put in our evaluator's name. Let's just say it's me, hypothetically. We can add in the names of our individual proposers here. So I'll say it's, keep it nice and simple. We'll say it's company A, company B. For now, in this hypothetical example, let's just assume we have 2 proposers. And then Lars Benson can use this workbook to evaluate each of these. You want to make sure the weighted categories here reflect your values for both the technical proposal, that's sort of the meat and the scope of the proposal, and the value proposal, that's the budget and how much everything costs. We have this listed at 85 and 15%, which I think is pretty reflective of what many agencies choose to weight them. Looking specifically at the technical proposal tab, here I'll list my evaluator name once again, and you can see that companies A and B that I listed on the overall scores tab are automatically populated on this sheet. I can look at a number of subcategories that I know I want to evaluate on, and these are my scoring criteria. So I have organizational qualifications and experience. We talked about that example, the details of the proposed program, project management, and a few others down here, DEI considerations, and then all of those sum to a total 100% weight across all the scoring criteria. I know I'm moving through this fast, but I should also add, we are going to put out a version of this worksheet that is fully populated with an example so that you can see it for yourself. And I'm always available to take questions and meetings where we walk through this in more detail. I'll insert an optional question here for organizational qualifications and experience, just to show you how it might work. And let's say that question is, how many years has your organization been in business? Maybe you want a particularly experienced organization. So I choose to weight that question at 10% of my total, and you can see that's reflected in the total for my subcategory. So it's 30% for organizational qualifications, 10% within that, and that sums up all the way at the bottom as I just showed. We have a row here, a column here for description of requirements, which is a place where you can document for your evaluators exactly what you want to see out of responses here. So I'll just include some really specific scoring guidance to help my evaluators. And I will say, if org has been in business for 5 or more years, score at least, let's say at least a 7 out of 10. And then they can add on additional points for additional years or for particularly good and impressive service. And I'll say if less than 3 years, score no more than 5 out of 10. So an organization that hasn't been in operation for more than 3 years, I don't want them getting any more than a 5 out of 10 because I'm really prioritizing that I want experienced organizations. That may be different from your RFP, for your specific RFP, but I'll just use that as the example. So as a scorer, I give a 1 through 10 rating on each question. So if I look at the proposal and I see company A has been in business for 8 years, that's fantastic. And their record looks great. I'm going to give them a 9 out of 10. That score is automatically weighted at 10% because that's the weighting I'm assigning to this question. And you can see if I chose to weight it at 15% instead, it would give a different final weighted score here, but I'll keep it at 10. Let's say I'm not going to insert questions here, but I'll just say that I give those scores for the remainder of this subcategory, and that's reflected in this subcategory total where they're getting a weighted 2.3 points. And this is reflected all the way at the bottom of this tab for the total technical score. And if I were to add points in each of these categories, that would also be reflected there. And that syncs back to the overall scores tab. So I can see my weighted results for the technical score are 2.4. I can do the same for the value process. I'll insert scores here as well. Let's say a 9, let's say a 2, let's say a 7. That's a big spread. They probably won't be a 9, a 2, and a 7, but just hypothetically. And those will also feed back to the overall scores tab. And then I have a total score for company A. They're given a 3.65. What I can then do as an evaluator is I can use the summary of scores tab here to sum across all the scores that I'm given across all my evaluators. So when my evaluators send me back their completed workbooks and they have filled out this overall scores tab, it's been auto-populated by their scores for the rest of these proposals, I can just take the weighted results, so I'll just copy those, and I can go to summary of scores, and I can just drop them in. Oops. Oh, I can't do it because it's the same workbook. Ignore that. So I'll just populate myself 2.4 and 1.6. And then it gives me an evaluator total. I'll say that this is for evaluator Lars Benson because that's the name I was using earlier. My evaluator total for company A is 4. And now I'm able to populate with whoever else. I'll say, Julia, help me out with this one, hypothetically. And let's say she gave them a better score than me. She gave them a 3.9 and a 2. And I can see her scores here as well. The reason that you're seeing this highlighting is because in the evaluator total row, this sheet automatically pulls out the highest and lowest scores for each evaluator. You can choose to use that feature if you find it useful or completely ignore it if you want. I'll just show you an example of how that works, putting in some random scores here. And now you can see how my scores automatically reflect the highest and the lowest in each category. So if I were to look at this as the facilitator, I could simply look at this tab and see, okay, I see that Lars has identified 2 that are really leaps and bounds above the best, and I could focus in on that to help steer the discussion I'm going to have. Once you go through and enter all of these proposals and evaluators, filling out this whole grid, you'll be ready to host your evaluation meeting. And you can use this summary of scores tab to help talk your evaluators through each of their scores and have them explain exactly what their justifications are for the scores that they choose to award. I can then use the summary of scores final tab here, which looks almost exactly the same, to log their final scores after any revisions that they might choose to make during the process. I know I moved through that really quickly, but as I said, we are going to distribute this via the OPM website, and it will include some instructions on how to use it. And you can always reach out to me or anyone else on the OPM finance team, and we will provide some guidance to you on how to use this tool. We're happy to sit down and do a workshop or have a meeting with you about it. So I'm going to stop sharing and give the screen share back to Julia. If you want to put up the next slide, please, Julia. Perfect. So you can go to the next slide. Just before we move into the Q&A, I want to briefly plug that DAS, of course, the Department of Administrative Services, also has their own procurement evaluation process. And I imagine that a lot of folks on this call and a lot of folks who work in procurement in the human service agencies have also worked with DAS on RFPs that they are doing for their agencies. Agencies often work with DAS to evaluate procurements for master contracts or for goods-based procurements that don't include services. And they usually work with DAS contract specialists who are highly trained procurement experts that will guide your agency through this evaluation and scoring process. When you work with DAS on a given procurement, the contract specialist who's assigned to facilitate that procurement will convene a sourcing team made up of members from your agency, and they'll help you select evaluators and form an evaluation committee from that team. We're also working with DAS procurement to standardize the evaluation process across different agencies. So in the future, when you're working with DAS, you'll be using a very similar workbook model to the one that I just showed that is OPM's optional tool. So you should have that standardization and consistency no matter which authority you're working on a procurement under. You'll be using roughly the same approach. I've been talking for a long time, so in the last 15 minutes or so of our training, I'm going to give some other folks a chance to talk, and I will be asking some questions that we've had submitted to Julia, Kathy, and Sheila, who I know have a lot of thoughts and experience to share. I know that we will not get to all the questions that people have submitted. I'm very grateful for folks for submitting so many questions. So we will also release an official Q&A document as a follow-up to this training in which we answer all of the questions that are submitted pretty thoroughly, and we make sure to give you answers on all of those. So I'm just going to start with the first question that I have here. So Kathy and Sheila, could you quickly share? Kathy, you already shared, but we'd love to hear from you, Sheila. How did you decide who to invite to evaluation committees that you have run? What kind of considerations have you thought about when doing that?
Okay, thank you, Lars. It was a great presentation. So DECD did a RFP to look for organizations to administer financial assistance and technical assistance programs for small businesses in Connecticut. So it was a 5-year contract and 125 million. So we're still in the final steps of, awarding the contract. So I'm not going to go into too much details, but for the committee, we wanted a cross section of folks with different expertise and background that would bring different perspectives to the process and to the interview. So for example, we wanted someone that really understood the needs of the small business community. We wanted someone that had a financial background. We got a couple of folks from Connecticut Innovation, so they had experience with startup businesses, venture capital businesses, and like I think you said during your presentation, maybe not exactly like this, but you left your titles at the door when you came in, when you sat on the table, or when you were, having discussions on Zoom, everyone was on equal playing fields. So, that's kind of my advice.
Great, thank you for that, Sheila. And I'm seeing a related question that I kind of want to piggyback off of from the audience. So a few folks have asked about engaging these out-of-agency technical advisors. So Kathy or Sheila, have you had any experience in engaging technical advisors in the RFPs that you have run, and any thoughts on whether that approach is helpful?
Well, in our situation, most of the technical advisors were actually submitting proposals. So in that case, we really didn't engage, any of the technical providers that we normally deal with in the small business world. So, we went to Connecticut Innovations. They're a quasi-public agency. And, some of their folks sat on the committee, and actually our commissioner, he wanted to sit on the committee too. So that was very, very helpful. So he was part of this whole process.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for sharing that. And the utilization of a quasi-public agency that you have these collaborations with, that's a great place to pull that kind of technical expertise from. So really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
A question that I wanted to turn to Kathy, and I think that Julia also may have some thoughts on this one from a standards perspective. How do you approach minimum requirements like formatting or narrow misses on particular deadlines for RFPs? Do you generally find that it's important to be really strict about those minimum requirements, or do you try to be a bit more lenient and flexible?
Yeah, Lars. So for OEC, we were very strict on the submission deadline, and we held to that. If it was 5 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, we held to that. As far as some of the other minimum requirements, some of it was related, and I think you talked about this early on, around formatting, and we actually, in the most recent RFP, we had a statement that said you may be disqualified for things related to formatting and things like that. And what we've found, for the majority of our applications, if we were looking for Times New Roman 12, that 95% of the application was done in it, but they might have had something else that was in a different font, and we certainly didn't want to throw out an application for that. So, but deadline, we held firm on that.
Yeah, and I would just add, from a more general perspective, just adding a little bit of color to Kathy's really helpful specific experience. From our perspective, I think when you're establishing those minimum criteria, the two goals for those are fairness and sort of facilitating a fair and reasonable review for the evaluation committee members. So certainly if you have a submission deadline and someone submits it a day late, that, you know, that bidder had an extra day to consider putting together a proposal, and so it wouldn't necessarily be fair to allow them to proceed as part of one of the, eligible proposals. And then in terms of formatting, I think Kathy gave the example of font and font size. That might be an area where you're willing to be lenient. I think in general, what we're trying to discourage is that every single proposal is in a completely different format, because then it becomes really, really difficult for the evaluation committee and really time consuming for the evaluation committee to compare. And it becomes like comparing apples and oranges. And that's really not fair. It's already a process that requires a lot of time and energy from the evaluation committee. And so those types of formatting requirements are really to standardize and make it as easy as possible for the evaluators to see how the proposers have answered questions. So that's something to sort of keep in mind when you determine like what is disqualifying and what's not, keeping in mind fairness and relative ease of proposal review and comparison for the evaluators.
Yeah, thank you both for that. That's a really tricky balance to strike. So I appreciate both of your answers there. I see we got a question. To keep you on the line, Julia, I'm curious. A few folks have asked a question to the effect of, can you use past performance in evaluation in some way? Can you consider experiences you've had with a proposer through previous RFPs or previous programs? How would you recommend agencies think about past performance when doing these evaluations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is sort of one of those things that is in the discretion of the agency. We have some ideas of the types of evaluation criteria, and we won't impose this one, but it can be a really, really useful tool. Because of course, if a proposer has a documented history of not performing to the level of quality that the state is looking for, that would be really important to know. And so the best way to utilize this as a criterion is to make sure that you have a process in place for evaluating the performance of a contract when it ends or at regular intervals during a contract period. The OPM standards and statute lay out the sort of requirements around performance evaluations, which do exist in statute, and we do have some tools and processes to facilitate that. And if you are good and regular about posting and keeping those up to date, it can be a very useful tool. And I think, one other thing I would want to mention is that, you would need to have some sort of formal process in place where there's documentation of poor performance, because you don't want to allow past performance to come into play just based on one subjective evaluator's experience. So it can't be, oh, I called them once and they were rude. You would want to base it more on, we had a specific expectation or deliverable in our contract, and the contractor failed to meet it. So, generally, definitely something that's doable and is in the agency's power, as long as it's done in a fair way. And it's something that, if you are looking to think about how to incorporate that into your evaluation process, OPM can sort of help provide guidance on how to do that.
Thank you so much, Julia. I really, really appreciate that answer. I have a similar question that I want to turn to Sheila, because I know that you've recently been working on this around checking references as a way to kind of assess how that vendor previously has done with other jurisdictions. How do you approach checking those references that they might submit as part of a proposal, and at what point in the process would you do that?
Okay. Well, first, you trim the list of organizations down to those that we want to interview. Then after the interview, what we did was, we're in the process of doing this now, we would email the references that were listed on their proposal. And then we came up with some standard questions to ask each reference. And so the next step with that would be actually tomorrow we're meeting with the committee. We're going to report back on the references. But you know, I think it's very, very important to do it after you you don't want to be, you know, calling 100 different, you know, sending emails to 100 different people. I think it's once you get maybe the top 3 organizations that you might want to award the contract to, then that's when you do a deep dive and call their references or email their references and set up some time. But, you know, it's just a really, really important process. But I would, you know, wait until, you know, you have identify, you know, the top 3.
Great, thank you for that. We still have a little over 20 questions, actually, a great wealth of questions to answer, and we do want to provide a detailed answer to every one of them. So understanding that we are out of time for our 90 minutes today, we will be releasing a Q&A document that includes all those questions and a detailed response to each one, and that will be sent out via email a little bit later on this week or next week. But really appreciate all of your questions and really appreciate you joining us for the training today. Julia, do you want to just jump to our thank you slide at the end here?
Sure. And just as we wrap up, this is the contact information for myself and Colin and Lars from our GPL team, who you can contact for questions that OPM Finance can help answer. We have this sort of plug slide reminding you about CT Source, but for time constraints, we're going to skip ahead to just say thank you. I posted a link to the survey that's listed here in the chat. It's really quick. We would love to get your feedback. We also want to apologize. I'm aware that there were some technical issues and technical difficulties. I sincerely apologize for that. And I hope that, you know, for many of you, this was still a useful training. We will be posting a recording, the slides, and a question and answer session. And if there are difficulties and sound issues captured in the recording, we will certainly figure out a way to make sure that the salient points from this training that the GPL and Kathy and Sheila worked so hard on get, you know, publicized to you all. So it is 2:31, so we're going to let everyone go. Thank you so much, Lars, for facilitating such a fantastic presentation. Thank you to Kathy Lenahan from OEC for sharing such fascinating insights from a really massive lift of an RFP and evaluation process, and to Sheila for being able to speak a little bit on a recent implementation of some of these evaluation best practices. We really appreciate you both being a resource. And on the topic of resources, feel free to reach out to myself, Lars Benson, Colin Earhart, with any questions about this training or others that OPM has produced. And we definitely look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.